Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is an internet series where we talk about designing better miniature games. We have been doing that for some time, and ye gods, it looks like we will not stop. Um, uh, Glenn and I were just chatting off camera about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is having my games succeed in some small way and not be immediately squashed on release. And I'm not this time round talking about global pandemics, but I've got a game that we've talked about a few times on this channel called Hobgoblin, which is a game of brutal fantasy battles, which I'm completely open and not shy about saying is, my a long time ago, probably sort of 8 or 9 years ago, reaction to playing a ton of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, that lodestone of square base fantasy battles for nigh on 30 years before they knocked it on the head. And so I wrote that game, and it sat around for a while, not getting developed and not getting published. And then a couple of years ago, through the Blaster connections, Greg Horton and I teamed up to put together a beautiful new illustrated, fully play tested, fleshed out with a fantasy world for it to reside in and exude. And that has been through a successful Kickstarter. And I just really definitely this time finished the manuscript, and it's off to be printed, and there'll be physical books arriving in places, hopefully before my birthday next year. You don't know when my birthday is, so I'm not making a date commitment. But in all of that time between having a game and languishing with a game, and then realizing I still wanted to make the game and getting the damn thing made, at the time of recording, everyone just started publishing content about Warhammer the Old World, because Games Workshop done re-released that thing that's been away for whatever it was, nearly 10 years. And so I am sitting here somewhat thoughtful about having a game that allows you to play rank and flank fantasy battles, that was sort of kickstarted in a situation where we kind of knew Old World was coming, but it was still fantasy, haha. And now it's real, and now people can play it. And whether or not it's exactly the game for you, whether or not the support will be long term or short term, whether or not you like the lumpy old models, all of that set aside, it's like it sort of raises a question for me that I was throwing at Glenn, which is like, it's easy to get carried away when you're a small scale indie creator with what might be possible with your games. And then it's easy to get knocked on the head and realize, like my place in this ecosystem is quite specific. And so I guess the way I want to frame this conversation is like, as an indie creator, how do you deal with being an operator in this ecosystem, and how do you kind of fight for your piece of turf, and what's the right way to think about that, and what are some ways that we have sort of thought about this. I haven't been, because I don't have infinite amounts of money, I haven't been buying all of the Ash Wastes Necromunda stuff, but like they keep releasing more and more cool vehicles for that game, and people keep telling me that like there's rolling road scenarios and you can play Mad Max combat and stuff in it. And I'd love to play that game because I want to find out if it is doing Gasland's things or if it is doing something completely different, because there's potentially another place where everyone playing Road Rash and Mad Max with Necromunda is like a Gaslands player I've lost. Or are they? Like, is that the wrong way to think about this? I don't know. Glenn, hit me.
I mean, it's tough because it's like, everything exists within a world of sort of healthy competition. And like, I mean, in respect for Gaslands, I remember like when we were at the UKGE where Gaslands won the People's Choice and Judges' Choice Award. Yeah, there was like a guy from a rival sort of Mad Max style miniatures racing game who came over partway through the day and basically said to us, okay, guys have been coming by buying our minis, and our minis come with like stat cards for our game, and they take the stat cards out and pass them back to us and go, I'm playing Gaslands with this, and then like walking off to your still. And so it's like, if your game's successful, it's eating somebody's lunch somewhere. You know what I mean? It's like, your game is not a sort of is not going to be a 100% unique snowflake. Even if it's doing something clever and special, it's going to be doing it in a certain genre or a certain shape, and somebody else is failing to get their thing out there and working because your thing is doing well. So it is, like you say, an ecosystem where it's like, where are you? And I guess the real question is, it's like, are you really in competition with Games Workshop?
Mm.
Is Mike Hutchinson actually in competition with Games Workshop? Is Mike Hutchinson is Hobgoblin in competition with the old world? Probably not. Is Hobgoblin in competition with Kings of War? Might be. Is it in competition with Saga Age of Magic? I think, mate. I don't really think that Hobgoblin is, you know, got the same demographic as Games Workshop. I think the sorts of people who pick up something like Hobgoblin are the sorts of people who own more than one rule book, and
Maybe, I don't
probably
know,
play
because
more
there's
consistent.
because I think that the Venn diagram of like, you know, it's not as true. Like there used to be more sort of other companies that were kind
Mm,
of, we could talk about as like, there's GW, and there's, there's also, Privateer, and there's Fantasy Flight, and like oddly that seems to sound more hollow these days. Like it really is. It's like GW's doing a fantastic job with an enormous range of games, and they filled up a lot of the design space where, like, if you want a sci-fi skirmish game, they offer that. If you want a fantasy skirmish game, they offer that. If you want an army game for either of those, they offer it. If you want, post-apocalyptic skirmish, they've got that. Like they're just filling up all of these little niches with these product lines, which with these games that are fine. And I quite like learning about the GW games and playing them to find out like what is the experience they're delivering, so that I, as an indie creator, can create a different experience where it's like, oh, okay, so if there's something about this game that you didn't like, or there's something about this game that this game doesn't provide for you, or that, there's going to be negative space in that design or in what the community is looking for. I mean, like an obvious example for, Hobgoblin and the old world is, the old world has made, for a number of reasons that, we can't know but we can guess at, it's made some decisions about which Warhammer factions to include and which to leave behind. And so if you have a Skaven army, which I do, you can't play the old world with that Skaven army. There might be a PDF coming, but the point being that like they're going to have to make some decisions about what is and isn't in the scope of their games.
mm.
And one of the things that you and I do as independent creators is lean towards much more permissive, miniature permissive systems, simply because it's in our interests to do so, and it solves problems like this. So in some regards, like as a creator of not miniatures, you've got one answer to this question, which is, well, I can broaden the catchment across these things. But also as just a creator of like games with or without miniatures, it's about, I don't know, I feel like it's about finding the negative design space.
I mean, I think there's a certain amount of that. I think there's. It's like I was watching an interview a little while ago with the guy who used to run like product design for all the accessories and paints and all that sort of stuff for GW. And they were talking about why GW has never done like a full airbrush or a set
Mm,
of airbrush paints. And what he was saying was that they think of it as a hobby trumpet. There's like a big opening bit where people come in, and then it sort of narrows out, and then there's these people down this end that like hardcore and stick in. And what he said was, is fundamentally we've given up on those guys down that
yeah.
far end. They're not our people. We care about the people at the mouth of the trumpet. And the reason we don't you produce an airbrush is the guys down there are the only guys using an airbrush, and they're not going to use our airbrush anyway. It's totally pointless. It's a waste of time. We're making, little paint kits that Jimmy can take home and paint because that's our target.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's where, like, as an independent creator of like, you know, use the word before we started, boutique games is like how I like to imagine myself. Like that that idea is absolutely right, and it's why I get a bit defensive when creators of miniature games of any sort get sniffy about Games Workshop, like,
Mm.
like I don't have to have an enormous education funnel for what miniature games are.
Yeah.
I can rely on mana from heaven raining down out of the bottom of this sales funnel that GW's created and has an enormous, retail footprint to do. So they can educate Jimmy, age 11, about why toy soldiers are cool and why they are as relevant as video games. And then as Jimmy gets further down that funnel, lots of his friends will not get any further and will paint three, Dark Elder and give up.
Mm.
And the people that drip down the bottom as highly refined, distilled, war game connoisseurs and long-term committers to this as their identity and hobby, like they will find the fine blended whiskey that is our products, and
Yeah.
that's who we're selling to. And
Yeah.
the idea that we're in competition with those other people, it's like, well, the place where it goes wrong is that where you've got clubs and groups of friends who want the stability of a game existing, and they want the patter of new releases and meta changing stuff to keep the conversation flowing. That's like where I can struggle to, as an indie creator, with the hours in the day that I have, to like give them enough to mean that like Gaslands or A Billion Suns keeps forcing its way back into their eye line or back up the queue, rather than playing the next, big expansion or new army book or whatever.
I know, but I mean, my feeling on that sort of thing is, yeah, but you will always be, struggle to supply the churn on that sort of thing. Even if GW didn't exist, and if no other game in the world existed, you'd still struggle to sort of keep new shiny sort of toy syndrome for certain people.
I suppose if you weren't fighting a single product line, you'd be fighting the noise that is the
Mm.
rest of the industry. Everyone's about to release something.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think as once you accept where you really are in the ecosystem of like creators and things, and you realize that something like GW produces like, editions, and in between editions there's this little bit of fallout where people are waiting for the new edition to really kick in, or they've gotten bored of the old edition, and the fallout of people around that edition change is worth more to you, of people who are like, oh, I've got a bunch of minis, I'm a bit off with the current rule set, what's about, oh, this'll do, I think is worth more than you than the competition that you're not really in GW with over is. Do you know what I mean? That it's like literally just the runoff between the sort
Yeah,
of
so practically speaking,
churn.
like if you want to sell a sort of squad platoon, sort of small army level sci-fi game, the best time to do that would be in about 3 years' time,
Hmm.
when the end of 10th edition is obvious and people are nervous about 11th, and you get your game out, 11th comes out, people are like, wow, they've ruined my thing, and they are looking around for other, or a 1 to 5% of them are looking around for other things, but that 1 to 5% is monstrous compared to anything that we could drum up through any other method.
100%. And this is the thing, it's like, saying about the education, the advertising, the getting people's eyes on something right next to what you're selling. It's like, if you're selling an apple, selling it next to a guy who has a 50-foot tall apple billboard is better than selling it just in the middle of the desert somewhere, because people are going to come to that, and he's paid for that billboard and you haven't.
That's right.
Now you can go, well, you don't want, oh, he doesn't happen to have pink ladies, I've got a barrow full of pink ladies. You came here for apples, and apples are apples. And personally, I think that the coming about of the old world will, on balance, be better for Hobgoblin than not. And it's partly
Right.
like,
I mean, like if let's say the book is going to be in stores in 6 months or something. Like if I could say the one thing that I want, magic wand, the one thing I want is a global renaissance of rank and flank square based miniature games for 6 months leading up to the availability of my product. Like that's essentially what I've got in this
yeah,
case.
yeah, yeah, 100%.
Nobody was thinking about these kinds of games
Hmm.
in the main war game space, and now at the very least everyone knows that they are a thing that can exist today.
Yeah, you what you've now got is you've now got an international mega company advertising the idea of putting minis onto square bases and then pushing them around and having a fancy battle.
I don't know if Glenn's heard about the fact that he has to rebase his dwarfs on 25 mil.
And they're not on 20 mil bases anymore. That's a foul and wrong thing to have done.
No. If you had rebased your armies for Age of Sigmar, then maybe it's not so bad. But if you were just holding on to your square based armies, then
It's a
anyway,
it's a
we
birthright
digress.
of
So I
dwarves to be
think
on 20 mil bases.
so. I think another thing that I think about is like there are there are many ways of coming up with game ideas, but like there are broadly two chunky, easy to get your head around ways of thinking about like game ideas. One is I want to create a better version of X. So like I played 40k. I think 40k has some problems. I'm going to create a better 40k. And then the other thing is to say like I'm going to go way out into the west and find the thing that just has got nothing around it and just be like, yep, this is going to be the like, this is going to be the post-apocalyptic dinosaur, skirmish combat with water, and like that's going to be amazing because nothing else is like that. And those are two like really, both of those come from a knowledge of what the rest of the main populace of that funnel is playing, and then making a distinction of saying, okay, I'm going to go after the people who like X but for whom X is not currently doing everything that it needs to, or I'm going to go after people with this completely separate, Y thing, which is like, hey, you didn't even know Y was a thing that could exist. How about some Y here?
Yeah.
Which I think is honestly where X-Wing, like that was one of X-Wing the miniature game's like strongest suits, was like there was just nothing like that out there. Obviously it had a super strong IP
Mm.
alongside it, but I just think like that like dog fighting thing, particularly with movement templates, was super niche, and suddenly there was like, oh wow, a game that looks like this doesn't look like anything I know about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like in the Hobgoblin Discord, and generally from people who've jumped on Hobgoblin, it's been interesting to me how many times we've had to sort of explain things like what a unit size is, and how big a forest should be, and how big a hill should be, because we came from an education of having played things like Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and I feel like if Warhammer Fantasy Battle had not died like 9 years before Hobgoblin came out, those questions wouldn't be so prevalent. And I think those questions from the people who buy Hobgoblin in 6 months' time won't be there. I think they will have. I think there'll be people who've been educated by Warhammer, bored by the old world, and looking around for something to do with the box of stuff that they bought in order to play old world. And I think that the number of people doing that will vastly increase the reach of something like Hobgoblins to what it could have reached otherwise. I think it's.
I mean, one of the really fun things about it for me is that like Hobgoblin very much comes from that first school of games design, which is like, I've played Warhammer Fantasy. There are some problems with it. Like, I want a different game. And anyone, in my opinion, anyone who's experienced the problems, anyone who has the same problems as me, I'm providing a pretty decent fix for those problems. Now, not everyone has those problems because everyone is different. And I think that for me, like, this juggernaut arriving and casting a shadow over the game, it scares up a bunch of people who are going to buy these square base armies. They're going to play the game, and some small percentage of those people will find exactly the same problems that I found with it. And then hopefully enough of a percentage of those people will discover by asking questions like, is there another way to play with these models? And somebody will say, oh yeah, well, Hobgoblin does this, that, and the other and fixes these issues. But like that's sort of a vector of people that I had given up hope on because of the time between, the last time anybody got frustrated with, which model is fighting which model in the front rank, which by the way they basically fixed. So well done.
Yeah, and yeah, I think.
So I think that like again, it's like I'm trying not to feel downtrodden or disheartened by this because there are many ways that like it's refreshing the top of the funnel, at which the bottom of the funnel is, oh, and Hobgoblin is the exact game that I want, and it would have been a smaller set of people and now it's a bigger one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, like, to sort of extend it out a little bit to some of my own experiences, that people have often said, how do I feel about the fact that there are massive companies on Kickstarter who don't need like Kickstarter to make their
Oh
game,
yeah.
etc., etc. And what I say is, those people bring people who come to Kickstarter and join Kickstarter and sign up to Kickstarter and then are hanging around with a
Mm.
Kickstarter account going, oh, is there anything else interesting out there? Those big companies are paying for advertising that is eventually going to filter down to someone like me. I really think that it's one of those things where a rising tide floats all boats. I also think, you're stuck with it. It's not like you can go out there, knock on GW's door and go, excuse me, sorry, I've got this other game coming out that's quite similar to your game in a few months. And, they kind of step on each other. So could you just
No,
cancel
no, but
it?
I think if you flip that around, I think it for me, it's that anxiety and that uncertainty about, is doing something too close to a GW thing a problem, or is it actually an advantage? And I think focusing on how can it be an advantage, what
Mm,
are the characteristics of a product or a game that takes advantage of this situation, rather than trying to fight it on its own terms. So, like, for example, if you create a very deep, broad science fiction army battle game where it requires a lot of people, like there are a lot of factions and the factions are very deep, that requires a large number of people, because otherwise you won't have enough people to learn all the factions and have those factions available for combat, that like the game's scope will never be accessible to the players that you can capture. If you have two or three really deep factions, okay, now we're talking, now we can get a meta going with a substantially smaller set of players. So I think, like, thinking about, well, where am I in relation to this and those customers that might be available to me, and like how am I making smart use of this, rather than trying to fight them at their own game, which of course nobody's really imagining they are, but like from a games design perspective you can definitely accidentally wander in that direction. Yeah, so I think that's really where I'm coming at this from. It's just a sort of walk away from this experience making sure that I'm thinking positively and constructively about where there is space in this community, in this industry, for small people in little starfighters to nip through the gaps and and grab some of the loot.
yeah, and again, sort of like I say, referring back to that interview that I was watching with the guy who ran sort of product design for GW, is that they don't think they're in competition with people like us. To them, people like us just don't sell any games. Like, for the volume that they're interested in, they would essentially let us put a table in their shop. So minor is the level of sales that we make in comparison to them. So they don't think that they're sort of in competition with us. They realize that this is an ecosystem in which they are a whale and we are a minnow, and those two things don't fight each other. They don't even understand the existence of each other in a sort of larger scale way. And I think
Mm.
that definitely, you know, as I say, the education, the advertising, the people that GW are going to bring in. And I think if you accept your place in the ecosystem and you're like, well, now I'm sitting underneath the giant's table and I'm looking for something to eat, and I can either sort of want there to be no giant and try and find food, or I can have things dropping off of his plate and have a mightiest feast that just happened to be fallen off of the giant's plate. And I think it's like, once you accept that you are a mouse, then it's like, yeah, I'd
Yeah.
rather have the giant there. I'd rather. I honestly think
Yeah, imagine if you had to explain wargaming to the man on the street, and there
yeah,
wasn't, you couldn't just say, "Oh, it's like that Warhammer thing that like some nerds that you knew at school played," and that there is a
no,
shop in your
absolutely,
town that sells.
100%. And it's like, I know that for myself, Saga and Test of Honor, and This Is Not a Test, and so many other independent games owe my custom to the existence of GW. If not for GW, I don't know that I would be a miniatures gamer. I don't know I'd be a board gamer or an RPG or a video gamer or something else. I know that I was brought into the hobby by GW, and I know that I have been a beneficial customer to a whole range of independent games by virtue of GW doing that. And I don't see why it shouldn't be the case for any other independent designer and any other independent game in the future.
Yeah. So, gentle viewer, if you are like me and worrying about a game that you're working on, why not tell us in the comments about where you're seeing like either an opportunity in between a big game system and the idea that you've got, or you're nervous about like, is there too much overlap? Like, am I in a space that's already overcrowded? Let us know in the comments. And if the comment section is too small for you, why not come into our Discord, where we can talk about it at length with a number of ever increasing number of wonderful games designers who are discussing endlessly on this and numerous other topics. You can find us on, well, you can find Glenn on social media. I may return to social media in this upcoming calendar year, but where you can find me and where you can support the things that I'm doing is on Patreon, Patreon/Planet Smasher Games. Drop a penny in the cup to help me continue working on both this podcast and the many miniature games that I have in my head and on my hard drive.
Okay. And I think generally from this episode of Rule of Carnage, then this will be goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye.